Linowit board.
I think everyone's back, so I can go ahead and get started. But well, Michelle answered the question about her favorite cereal. Does anyone else want to say their favorite cereal? I might use it later.
You can type it in the chat.
Or maybe we're not maybe this works better with my students. They eat more cereal than we do.
My favorite cereal, this is Belinda, is Kashi. I call them Kashi O's. I really don't know what they are.
Oh,
it's a Kashi.
I know what they are. Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
I like a lot of the Kashi cereals, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
My students usually say, well, Lucky Charms or the Captain Crunch donut cereal, which is like a pound of sugar in every bite. So, and I'll talk a little bit later about why I'm asking you that question. And you all know that the session's being recorded, but I put this slide in here just because I do that a lot in my classes, just to remind myself to start the recording. So I don't know about Zoom, but in Collaborate, it doesn't automatically record. And now after the update, Collaborate does say, do you want to start recording? But before that, quite often I would forget to start the recording, and then I would remember halfway through class. So it's nice to put a slide in your presentation just as a reminder to you to start the recording, and also to let your students know that you will be recording.
So Claire, in Zoom, you can set it up to record automatically each time you do class, if you do a recurring meeting, or you can turn it on and off. Even if you set it automatically, you can turn it on and off with just the little buttons at the bottom of your screen.
Okay. So I had mentioned, in case you were away from the computer, I don't actually use Zoom, and here I am talking about teaching using Zoom. I use Blackboard Collaborate for my actual class, and the number one reason why I like Collaborate is because of the emojis, which sounds really silly, but students love it, and I like to incorporate them, which you'll see throughout the presentation. I've also used WebEx, which is a nice tool, but it's not really that great for education, for when you're meeting with students. And Teams, I know Owens has Teams, and I've used that too. That I would say is too advanced for students and for faculty. There's a whole lot of stuff to know in there, whereas it seems like Zoom is pretty easy to figure out, and so is Collaborate. I won't give a huge introduction about myself, but I do just kind of want to mention quickly kind of all the different roles I've had, because I call myself a jack of all trades, master of none. I have had several different jobs at the University of Toledo, and even when I was teaching, I started as a high school physics teacher. And that's important because really it's led me to where I am today, and how I got into synchronous teaching. But I was an educational technologist, and then an instructional designer, and then I oversaw our testing center at the university, and now I oversee curriculum and research. And so throughout all those different roles, I really like getting a new job because it's a learning experience, but I've really learned what not to do more so than what to do from all of my failures. So really the next half hour is going to be me talking about my failures. But it's really helped me to learn how to teach synchronously online, because I've been doing this for, about 5 years now. I've been teaching synchronously. In our math department, we have a requirement that all of the online classes have to meet once every week online we use Blackboard Collaborate. So I have made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I'm sure I still will. I will go through kind of quickly just some things that I do in Blackboard for my synchronous classes that has been successful or helped my students to be successful. And then your first synchronous session should be different than the rest. So I just kind of want to talk about what I've gone through to help my students. And then kind of, what not to do. That's this third bullet here, is where I'm really going to talk about my failures. And then I'll talk about how I have, some tips and tricks that I've discovered that have helped my students to be engaged. I think probably some of you thought, oh, math. Most people cringe when I tell them I teach math. I even cringed myself as a college math student at math. But my students actually do really have fun in our weekly sessions. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then if there's anything else that you want to know about, we can talk about that at the end. So I do want to switch over to, I'll just switch to my desktop here and show you. So this is my course for spring. You can see it, right? Okay, and I just want to show you kind of quickly some things down here that I put in my course. So I call my weekly sessions virtual class, and that's kind of a title in the making because the first semester I taught, I called it web conference, which I kind of feel is like an outdated term. And then I called it video conferencing, which I also think might be a little bit outdated. I've kind of settled on this virtual class title, not that you have to use that, but it is good to put, a direct link right here into Blackboard. And then for your very first session, I always lock this course room because even though you tell students in announcements and syllabus and over again in email, click on the link that has the date that we're meeting, they don't. I mean, the majority of them do, but I always get a handful of students on the first class who come into this course room instead. So if you are using Collaborate, if you're using Zoom, this doesn't apply, but if you're using Collaborate, just make sure to lock the course room or else students will be in the wrong place on your first class. But I also have a separate section where I like to upload the PowerPoints that I use in my sessions. I don't usually create these very far in advance because I modify them based on what my students are struggling with, but I do like to have them up here at least a couple days before we meet. Partially, for my own self to have them done in time, but students also can feel a little bit nervous about these sessions, especially if they've never met or had a synchronous class before. So it's nice to have these PowerPoints here for the students who kind of want to go through it before class. If they are nervous, that kind of helps alleviate some of the anxiety. So I've had students tell me that, it really helps them to know what I'm going through before they come to class. They feel more at ease. And then if you are using Collaborate, on this page, there's a way to get to the recordings, but I find it a little bit difficult for students. It's extra clicking. So I actually create a separate button called virtual class recordings, and then I put the links here so that it's just easier for them, especially when they've never taken a synchronous class before, where they can find the recordings quickly without having to click around a lot. So now I will go back. If anyone has any questions, you can stop me. I'm very informal.
I do have a question really quick.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So if you are posting your virtual class recordings, do you find that they stop attending during the scheduled time because you post your recordings, or is this just as a, here you can rewatch it if you miss something type of thing?
I'm kind of surprised by this, but when I first started teaching synchronously, I thought there's no way my students are going to want to come. I don't even want to go. The whole point of an online class is to do it when you want, not have a scheduled time. I don't really like commitment, which is something you'll learn about me. But so to have like a scheduled day and time for an online class just was ridiculous. But my students, every single one of them come to the sessions and they love them. And if I say sometimes they're like on Halloween, I made it optional one semester. They all came anyway. So I was actually surprised, and they said that they really like the synchronous sessions. They get to ask questions, they get to talk to each other. It's that one time throughout the week where they really get to be in, a community. I have some discussion boards and things, but it's not quite the same. So students actually do not skip class because I post the recording. Plus they know the recordings are really boring. I mean, even if the class is fun, the recording is not fun to watch, I'll admit. And no one really wants to listen. I hate listening to my voice. So yeah, that's not a problem that I've had. So I want to go through some things that you should do in your first class, or that I recommend doing in the first class. I actually take screenshots of the tool that I'm using. So these screenshots that you see are of Collaborate, but if you're using Zoom, I would recommend taking some screenshots, putting one on each slide in your PowerPoint, and then I actually draw arrows in here and I say, here's the menu button. If you click on that button, this is what you see. So you can use your phone in case you can't hear me, rather than telling me you can't hear and I can't really troubleshoot while I'm teaching. So I'm trying to give them some tips and tricks of things to do. So if they have technology problems, they can kind of figure it out on their own and not have to ask me in the chat, because I'm not good at talking and typing to them a separate question at the same time. So it is helpful to take some screenshots to kind of explain to them where things are, how to use Zoom or Collaborate. Here's another screenshot from Collaborate, and I say, here's the microphone icon, here's the camera icon. And you might think that it's kind of self-explanatory, but students really are not necessarily good at technology. And I've had students who are great on their phones, but not a computer. And the more I dug into that, I realized, when they're in high school, they're using iPads and mobile devices. They're not actually using computers. And actually, a couple years ago, someone said, how do I get to the second page of the discussion board? And I'm like, you click the next arrow. Isn't that self-explanatory, or don't you see it? But they do ask a lot of questions like that, because this is all brand new for them too. So even if you think, it's self-explanatory that this big icon with the microphone is the microphone button, it's helpful to explain it to students. Plus, it also lets them know that you think that even the basics, that you have to go through the basics and that it's not a stupid question. So here's just, some more screenshots of things I go through. So I highly recommend going through the settings of whatever tool you're using in your first class. But I kind of want to ask all of you this, and you can turn on your microphone or turn on the chat, but what you think is the biggest problem with presentations, whether that's virtual in something like Collaborate or Zoom, or if it's in a face-to-face classroom?
For me, it's always that they're very passive.
For me, it's that they feel that they can be doing something else. Like if I say, get out your, keep your computer up because we're going to be looking at something in a face-to-face class, then I start, talking, and then I realize that two of the students are completely involved in something on the computer that has nothing to do with the class I'm teaching right now.
Okay.
So to bring them back try to bring them back without sounding like a 7th grade teacher. Okay, close your books now. Give me or 2nd grade teacher. Show me your eyes.
Flipping the lights on and off.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I know those are all things I learned when I was getting my teaching certificate. Doesn't work in college.
I would say one of the challenges I have, and it seems to be a generational thing, but they don't like to turn their cameras on. So they don't want to be seen. I don't either, but I do. And it seems like when I ask them to please put their video on, it's met with resistance. And it's hard to have a discussion when in a face-to-face online class, it's hard to have a discussion when you can't see each other.
It is.
And Owens has actually frowned on us. We can't really mandate that they turn them on because of they call it an equity issue. In case someone is embarrassed where they live, or they're embarrassed by their appearance or something. So we can't actually mandate that they turn them on, but we can make it so they want to turn them on, I guess would be the best way that I could say that.
Well, so here's another thing to learn about me. I love being a student, so I'm always in school. As a student, I would not want to turn my camera on, but that doesn't mean that I'm not engaged. And when I teach synchronously, I actually have 45 students in each section. So to have 45 cameras on would be a lot. I don't require my students to turn on their cameras. In fact, I prefer that they don't. It takes more bandwidth. And so I'll go over some tips, and I only have like about 25 minutes, so I might go a little bit fast. So slow me down or ask questions if you have any, but I'll go through some tips and tricks of things I do to make sure that my students are still engaged and that we can still have a discussion even though their cameras aren't on. But the reason I asked about what the biggest problem is I just want to make sure that I address all of those issues that everyone faces. And I kind of want to explain quickly, because I'm short on time, kind of where all of this comes from. So when I was a high school teacher, I taught math and physics, but I taught 4 sections of the same math class, and I would compare each section how well they did. And I had a section that would always do worse than the other sections. And for one of the formal assessments, they did better than all the other sections. And I thought, well, that's odd. And so I looked at what I assessed them on, and I realized that a big portion of what that assessment covered was something that we had gone over the day that we talked about nanny cams. And I don't even know how we got into this discussion of nanny cams, but we were laughing and we were so off topic. But it turned out that they actually remembered that content more than anything else. And so I really got interested in neuroscience, and, you know, I won't tell the whole long story, but it turns out that when you're working in groups and when you're getting off topic or when you're laughing, you know, that actually helps you remember things better, even if it's not related to the content. So the big issue, and we know this from a lot of research, people only remember 10% of what they learn. So you have to make sure that, you know, the 10% of your presentation that is the most important is something that's very memorable. And that brings me to the question of, why do people forget? And I can actually answer that in one word: habituation, which is where you kind of get used to something. So like in the summertime, my office window I would open, and I worked a lot at night. And so I would hear the cicada. And at first when I would start working, I thought, oh, I love the sound of cicada. But then like half an hour later, I wouldn't even notice that they're there anymore. And I'm sure probably some of you have habituated to things. I don't see anyone having children running by the screen, but maybe you have children. You know, Liz said she has babies. Maybe you heard them at the beginning, but now you don't, or maybe you have a space heater. I don't know. When I turn my space heater on at first, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so loud. And then, you know, 20 minutes later, I don't even notice. So that's really also why people forget, and we don't want them to habituate. Probably some of you, unfortunately, hopefully, haven't habituated to my voice. But that's really what our synchronous sessions we want to avoid, is habituation. So there are some ways that we can do that. And I'll kind of go through some of those. In your presentation itself, I mean, the colors you use and the way that you talk, even changing the inflection of your voice will help your students from not habituating. But we also want to keep them active and engaged so that they are more likely to remember what you're learning. So really how scientists say they prevent habituation is by causing a dopamine release. And that's where your, you know, the pleasure and reward center of your brain. And so our students actually have dopamine released in their brain when there is a reward or when there's uncertainty. So I don't know, are there any hockey fans or football fans? Okay, there's football fans. So I think there's a lot of anticipation and uncertainty when you're watching the Buckeyes play the Wolverines. Buckeyes fans probably won't say that, but I went to Michigan, so I am a firm believer. I'm a firm believer that they are on par, or they are good competitors. But okay, maybe like the Red Wings and the Blackhawks is more comparable. But when you have two sports teams that are playing and you really have no idea who's going to win, okay, maybe like the Clemson Ohio State game, you know, last week, when you don't know who's going to win, it's a lot more exciting, and your brain is actually releasing dopamine. So when you're teaching, you want your students to be, you know, kind of on the edge and wondering, you know, what's going to happen next. So I want to kind of give some specific examples of how you can do that. And the reason why is because when you release that dopamine, when you have their attention, or how you do that is by using the senses. So if you have, you know, brightness, and obviously you want to keep accessibility in mind. So you don't want to have, you know, a pink slide and then a green PowerPoint slide. But if you, you know, use bright colors for the words that are the most important that you want them to remember, that helps. Having sound, having videos. You can even sometimes just take a YouTube video, post the link in the chat, have students go watch it, and then come back to the session if you're using a tool that doesn't necessarily play the video right in your window. And kind of to go back to the cereal example that I asked at the beginning. So Michelle said she likes Lucky Charms. When I'm teaching, then somehow I would figure out how to throw Lucky Charms into one of the questions or the discussion, or utilize it, or even just, use her name. But as soon as, Michelle hears Lucky Charms, she probably perks up. Yeah. And so I like to make sure those students who show me that they're a little less engaged, week to week, I try to pay extra attention to what their answers are. For example, I had a student once who was an astronomy major, and he didn't really seem very interested in learning at all. But I would then try to use astronomy examples in, the questions that I would use. And because he did actually really like astronomy, it was just everything else he didn't like. And it grabbed his attention. So when you have students who are less engaged, if you know a little bit about them, I do an introductory discussion board at the beginning of the semester. So I have information about them there too, that they have a dog named Spot. So if you can use that in your lessons, it will help grab their attention. So some other ways that I engage my students is, that slide that I had up about the cereal. I always put a slide up before class starts so that when they log in, there's something for them to do. It creates a community. It helps them get to know each other. It helps them get to know me. It gives them something that we can talk about that's not related to the content, so they don't feel like I'm grading them. Chocolate or vanilla, well, there is a right answer there, but your favorite movie or favorite book, there's no right answer. So they can tell me whatever they want, and they don't have to worry about being judged or told that they're wrong. And then a lot of times I ask them, what's their favorite joke? So it really helps them to relax, and it gets them warmed up. They are a lot more engaged and responsive throughout class when we have that conversation. And then usually we bring those conversations up, even weeks later, and we laugh about it. So
Claire, when you ask these questions, do they just tell you the answer, or are they telling everybody their answer?
So in Collaborate, there's actually a way for them to write on the whiteboard. I actually have them write, and on here there is an annotation option. So you could
There's a whiteboard option as well in Zoom.
Or you could have them type in the chat. My students don't usually like to turn their microphones on, but they will chat up a storm. So either one is fine, whatever works. And every class is different. I like to ask him, I want to take a vacation to blank. So just totally not related to content. This one I like, although if you have all of our faces up, you can't really see. So since I teach math, I give them a huge box to just put an X in for math as their favorite subject, and then a little box for all the other ones. And they think that's funny. They try to cram them all in to like the English box, and I'm like, So these are just some examples of some slides you can put up at the beginning of class to get them to participate. Everyone has a birthday. And then if, it's January, all the people who have X's in January, you just say, happy birthday, or whose birthday is the soonest. So it does create a lot of conversation pieces. This slide about failure is something that I put up usually, 4 or 5 weeks into the semester, before their first big assessment. Before their first assessment is important. And that's because we do not talk about failure ever, really, in society. And I think failure is seen as a bad thing. And so I talk to my students to say, failure is not a bad thing. It's a learning opportunity. It's okay to fail, but let's talk about how we can prevent it or how we can learn from it. I don't want them to fail on their first big assessment. So it's kind of my way of saying, what can we do to prevent your failure? What failures have you had in the past, and what would you have done differently in your classes? So I tell my students, I teach math, I have a doctorate. I'm obviously not stupid, but I failed math classes in college. And for 4 years, I thought I was stupid and I thought I was a failure. And so I'm very open with them. It builds, trust between us. And it also helps them prepare and to know that, it's okay if they fail, but it takes so much anxiety away. And I think students just have a lot of anxiety in general, and they always want to get that A. So this has been a very helpful discussion topic that I've done at the beginning about a third of the way into the semester. I mentioned earlier that I like to use the emojis that are in Collaborate. I don't see any in the chat in Zoom.
There's emotions.
Okay.
So if I put
Okay.
up on my screen, you can
Oh,
see
I
a
see.
thumbs up.
Okay, I see. Cool.
And so they can use those. They don't call me emojis, they call me motions.
Okay.
So,
So how I like to use the emojis is I don't have my students turn on their cameras, and I like to have them, you know, particularly in math, they're solving problems, but in education, they might be looking something up, watching a video, they might be thinking about their answer. And so I say, you know, when you're done, when you have your answer, put your favorite food emoji in the chat, or put, you know, your favorite weather emoji in the chat. And they really love it. And it's a way too for us to, what, you know, for the students who finish early, for them to discuss, oh, haha, I didn't even see the pizza emoji in there. So it kind of gives them a way to talk to their peers while they're waiting. But it also allows the students who need more time to have more time, and they don't have someone, you know, breathing down their neck or staring at them. So the emojis is kind of a cool way to have students communicate with you when you can't see their face. I also really like polls. So I ask poll questions, and not just right or wrong questions. Sometimes I do, just to make sure that they're understanding, and partly are they still there in front of their screen. But I want to go through some examples of poll questions that I use. So maybe in education, I would talk about, you know, classroom management. Let's say you have a student who's acting out, and what would you do? And I say, you know, here are the options. I might even put another option in there, and then that can spark some discussion. But this, for one thing, helps me make sure that the student's still sitting there, that they're following along. And I like to see what their answer is, because I grade my sessions on their participation. So the day after, so I meet with my students at night, and then the next morning I'll grade, and I write individual feedback to each student. Well, if I had a student say, I would talk to the student's friends, and maybe I disagree with that, if there is a right or wrong answer, or maybe there's several correct answers, I would say, well, you could also do this. So polls are a great way for me to give individualized feedback to my students when I'm grading them the next day. So sometimes I just ask a really simple poll question: how easy is this? And that also helps students communicate to me whether or not they're following along. And it helps me to see, again, because I can't see their faces, are they understanding this or are they not understanding it? So I really like the poll questions. It's helpful when they're not all turning their cameras on. I also like to ask a lot of authentic questions that they can actually apply. That's a great way to get them thinking. And having them think is also a way to engage them.
so quick question on the poll question.
Mhm.
I forget, does Collaborate Ultra have a polling feature?
Yep.
Okay.
So in Collaborate, you can do however many options you want. You just fill them in yourself, or you can do a yes, no quick poll.
Yeah.
What I don't like about Collaborate is when you open or start the poll, you have to type the question and all the options, and you can't do ahead of time. So I like to keep my polls, you know, the options pretty short, because I have to talk and type at the same time. So let me go back. This one is very easy for me to do because I can type, those are each just a couple words each. But like this one, that would be probably very difficult for me. So I might actually give them a task while I'm typing this question in.
So if you didn't have the poll feature, or you didn't want to use the poll feature, for example, Zoom, I don't think you can't use it unless we have the upgraded feature. But you can use a thing called Poll Everywhere. So if you guys are interested in polls, we can look at that. But also you could just ask this question and ask them to type in the chat,
Yep.
3, 4, 5,
Yep.
and do the poll that way.
Yeah. Or you don't even have to have them answer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can just answer. When students are, you know, when they have a screen between them and you, they are so honest in the chat. It is scary. I mean, they will just come right out and say, this is easy, this is hard, this sucks, this is awesome. I'll even ask them, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, how hard is this? Where 5 is awful, 1 is easy. And they think it's hilarious. 3.14, you know, they'll always put decimals in there. But it's an easy way to get them to communicate with you about how difficult it is. And this is what I meant about the authentic questions. I actually tell them, this is when you'll see this again. I also like to use images, and I like to use funny images. And actually in neuroscience, they call them Easter eggs. Sometimes they'll like hide images in the background. And so this is a dopamine release because students are always wondering, what funny image will come next? So this is just an example of a math problem I use, but I found a, funny picture that kind of goes along with it. This one I think is just hilarious. And it matches kind of the question. So if you can have funny pictures that have to do with the content, that gets students engaged too. If they're laughing and having a good time, then they're gonna pay attention and they're not gonna want to Facebook or do something else. So, and we kind of talked about this already. You can just ask questions and have them type them in the chat if they don't want to turn their microphones on. So that's another good option. Sometimes I just ask them, what are your thoughts on this stuff? And they very rarely turn their microphones on, but they will type in the chat, this is what I think. Or you can say, put a thumbs up or a thumbs down emoji, or in Zoom, I saw Michelle put a thumbs up, so you could have them do that.
So that's what I was going to say. Do you then tell everybody what's in the chat? I mean, do you say like, oh, so do you do that? Do you say, Michelle thinks that this stuff is really hard? Or you just, do you expose what they've chatted even though everybody can see it?
Not usually individually. I'll just say, oh, okay, it looks like the majority of you are okay. The majority are not okay. Let me go back. If there are a few who are not okay, then I'll address that in my feedback with them the next day. When I'm asking a question that has a right or wrong answer, they are very competitive and they always want to be the first one to type the answer in the chat, which is why I use the emojis if I want the students who need more time to have more time. But sometimes I don't. I like them to compete and I give them fake points, kind of like whose line is it anyway? Points that don't matter. And so I'll say, oh, Billy gets 1 million fake points for being first, and for some reason that's entertaining to them. So, I mean, I don't know how motivated I would be about fake points, but they are very competitive. Which kind of brings me to my next point. Something I've done before is have them send a picture with an explanation. So let me, like in education, I would have to think of like an authentic question that you would ask them. You could say, I don't know, not education related. Take a picture of your favorite shirt and email it to me with an explanation of why it's your favorite shirt. And then I'll pick out my favorite. So this is a dopamine release because to them, that's a reward. And maybe I could turn this into an education conversation because I would say, all right, let's look at this. Everyone has totally different shirts that's their favorite. Yours is a fleece, yours is brown, yours is blue, yours has holes in it. So it kind of talks about how diverse everyone is, and maybe you could use that as a segue into talking about diversity or differences, or maybe even how everyone learns differently because they are different. So if you have them get up from the computer and go find something and take a picture and then email it to you, as long as it's related to the content, it's a good way to get them up and moving, and then you don't have to talk for 3 hours. I've done that before and it works pretty well. With 45 students, my inbox gets kind of full, so I can't look at every single one. So I just kind of randomly pick my favorite one. They don't know. And then I do have students participate on the whiteboard, which is difficult for some students. So sometimes I'll just say, turn your microphone on and tell me what you would write on the whiteboard. But I do have some examples, kind of some silly examples of something. You could have them label a picture. This one I put up here because then I did it once for something related to the content, and then it sparked this conversation whether a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable. Well, that conversation really had nothing to do with the content, but like the nanny cams, it does help them remember it better. So if you can have pictures or have the activity where they're labeling things on the whiteboard, if it leads to a discussion also, that's just going to make it an even more powerful educational experience. I use the groups tool, which both Zoom and Collaborate has. That's a good way to have students discuss how and why. You want to give them something that is a deeper discussion and not just a correct or incorrect answer. I like to give students questions that I don't think any of them will even know the answer to. And then that way they kind of have to like suffer through it together as a group and come up with the answer. So those are great ways to, or types of questions to give students that they, questions that they have to figure out as a group. So here are the specific types of questions I might give them, conceptual, critical thinking questions. I'll give them questions even maybe that have more than one answer. I like case studies when I'm teaching education, only because there really is no correct answer quite often, and then that gets students discussing. Sometimes I'll show them an answer or a solution, maybe a wrong answer or solution, even to a case study. I might say, this is how this person approached it, and this was, wrong. They hit someone, or I did do a case study about that once. I was teaching, I have a master's in epidemiology, and so we were talking about food safety, and the worker got mad and he hit something at work. Well, then you just talk about, why is that not the correct approach, or should that employee be fired or not fired? So sometimes showing, this is what I did at first and it didn't work. What should I do next? Where you have a partial answer, those are good questions. Any type of question that you base on their experience is really going to lead to a lot of discussion. So if you ask a student, what factor in a student's personal life is going to most greatly affect that student's learning, every single person in the group is going to have a different answer. So someone might say, the relationship with their friends. Someone might say, if they have a pet. Someone might say if they're poor or wealthy. Someone might say, racial differences. So everyone in the group, I guarantee, will have a different answer, because there is no correct answer. And the answer that they give is probably because that is what affected them the most when they were a student. And so I like those types of questions where each person's answer is based on their own experience, because then they get to learn what others' experiences are like. And so it does help spark discussion, but it also is a really good learning opportunity for them. I also have actually given them quizzes in a synchronous session. So I'll say, okay, let's pause here. I want you to go take a 5 or 10 question quiz in Blackboard, and I'll have it open. They just go in, they come back, and then they can just let me know in the chat when they're back, or I can give them, a certain amount of time. But you can actually pause and give them a quiz, whether that's graded or not, whether it's, right, wrong answers, essays. It's kind of, if you want to use polls, but you don't have a poll tool, you could actually just use the quiz tool on Blackboard, since we all have access to Blackboard. Are there any questions about the questions? Okay. I have 1 minute to tell you, here's my email address. So if you give me 20 minutes to talk or 200 minutes, I will take the topic and fit it in that, amount of time. So here's my email address if you have questions. I'm an email junkie, and I'm happy to answer any questions or answer any emails that I get, unless anyone has questions now.
Claire, do you mute your students? Do you control the mute on your students or not?
No, they all have their microphones muted, but I have it so that they can turn them on, and I've never had a problem with them turning them on when they shouldn't. And I'm really informal, and I tell students, turn your microphone on and scream at me if I'm going too fast or if you have a question. And I teach freshmen, so some of the students who are probably less mature than others, and I don't have an issue with that. And I don't ever have students writing on the whiteboard either, unnecessarily. They're pretty well behaved.
Does anyone have any further questions for Claire? That was amazing. Thank you. That was very well done. I appreciate it.
Had a lot of terrible synchronous sessions, so I can tell. So that's how I got here. But I do highly recommend practicing. Don't wait until classes start or your first class, because it's like my first session was scary. I mean, my first couple sessions were scary because there's so much going on, and you have to talk and upload your PowerPoint and look at the chat. And I mean, you're doing a lot of things all at once. So, and now for me, I can, pretty much do it in my sleep. I know where all the buttons are and I can multitask, but it took me a while to get there. So practice. And if you want to send me an email and hop into a session, kind of like Michelle said earlier, I can do that too.
Yeah, I know it really helped us when we were doing that virtual conference because, like I said, I'm an ed tech major and I was petrified doing breakout rooms and things like that. And once I did it a few times, and I think Belinda and Elisa also did it, they're like, once we did it a few times, it was okay. I felt okay with it. So, and I know where I sit at Owens, there's several instructors that teach synchronously around me. And one, I can hear them because it's so quiet, first of all. But, and a lot of times they'll come and tell me about their frustrations. And it's a lot of what Claire is talking about is, I don't know if they're paying attention. I don't know if they're there. No one's answering any. I pose a question. No one turns on their microphone. I can't get them to answer. And so I think that's the frustration that some instructors are having is they'll pose a question, they get no answers. So, I don't. Do you want to speak to any of that?
Yeah, so I had that when I first started teaching, putting up those slides at the beginning, like I said, that really helped the more I know my students. But poll questions are a good way to get students to participate because they don't have to type something in the chat and they don't have to turn on their microphone. I very rarely get students who don't answer the poll questions. So that's a good, easy icebreaker into participation. But I always have at least a couple students who will turn on their microphone. And usually after the first class, my students are very chatty in the chat. So if you're, I highly recommend having an introductory discussion board post where they introduce themselves on the discussion board in your course and have them tell you a couple things about themselves that are not academic related. And then I use that in my lessons somehow. I'll pull that information in and then it really helps get their attention. And sometimes when I have students who I know are comfortable participating, I will say, well, what did you get? Or what do you think? I will actually call them out because I know that they're not sitting there petrified.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the introduction, although when I was most recently a student, it was like, you have to introduce yourself again. But then it really helped going back and looking at other people's posts and you felt like you knew them by the end of class. So that was really helpful as well. I think you do the same thing in all your classes that you take now too. As a student, you still have to do an introductory post and pictures and things like that.
As an instructor, I go back and look at those all the time throughout the semester because I'm like, oh, did he like cars or did he like soccer? Was it this person or that person? So
yeah,
the more you know about your students personally, the easier it is to get their attention and to teach them. And I actually respond to every single person's discussion board post. And I will say, I'll find something that we have in common. So that's pretty easy to do. I have something in common with everyone and so do you. So I have them tell me 3 or 4 things about themselves and then I pick one and then, building that connection also helps them feel more at ease. They know that I'm human and I don't bite.
Yeah. So you've taught face-to-face and you've taught asynchronous web courses and you've taught synchronous courses. Do you feel that teaching synchronously, you lose any sort of connection with your students or?
No, I think I have better. I think teaching synchronously is better than face-to-face because all of my students get to participate. Now I have 45 students in one class. In a classroom, they don't all get to talk. They don't all get to ask questions. And even when they're discussing in groups, I don't get to hear what everyone's saying. Well, when they're in groups or using a discussion board, they all get to talk because they can all do it at the same time on a discussion board. And I can then actually review what every single person has said. So as someone who loves to talk, as a student myself, I prefer online because I get to talk a lot. Whereas in class, I don't because I have to, be fair and give other people a chance to.
So you feel like you've built connections with your students. You're able to make that connection that so many people value face-to-face, and I value it face-to-face. I loved meeting my students and so forth. And so I think building that connection is huge, but you put a lot of work into it as far as getting to know the students, doing that extra thing of taking a look at what they're interested in and things like that.
Yeah. I feel like I don't have any lost students, you know how you always have probably in face-to-face, a couple students who sit in the back and you probably don't really know who they are as much, but online it's harder for them to be passive.